Welcome to Friendly Words, the sermon podcast of Pratt Friends Church in Pratt, Kansas. The testimony you're about to hear was originally shared at Pratt Friends Church on Sunday, March 26, 2023. It's a story of how God watched over and protected Kim Stewart's son Ben as he suffered a stroke while driving from Kansas to Idaho. Now, here is Kim and her testimony.
So in your program, it does say testimony, and most of the time that's a student testimony, but we always just try to be in tune with what God is doing and what He wants. And so as I asked the students and we prayed over it, none of them felt that nudge like they were supposed to share. And I think I know why. It's because as I prayed over it, I knew that I needed to share a testimony this morning. This is like second family to me here at your church. Mike and Susan are my cousins and have journeyed with me many, many years. And I've shared my testimony with you. It was I think it was February of 2020, right before all COVID shut everything down. But my personal story of how I fell off a riding lawnmower and my leg was caught under the blade, and how God spared my life from that and then has done miraculous healing in my life. So many of you have heard that testimony, and I'm willing to share that at any point, but I'm going to share a different one with you today. But I think that God just had that in mind, that this body is such a faithful group of people, and it's a privilege to share what He's done for me. And so I feel like this morning I'm supposed to share with you my son's journey and some of the miraculous things we've seen happen in his life. So I'll begin with, I have a son. My husband and I live in Haviland. He's a retired firefighter. I have just recently resigned from teaching at high school, at Kiowa County High School in Greensburg. I teach vocal there, but I'll be done at the end of the year. At this point, I'm continuing to stay at Berkeley as far as I know, and so that's who we are. We have two children. Our daughter Natalie is married and lives in Newton, and she's a dental assistant there. And then our son Ben and his wife Riley live in Meridian, Idaho. And so this is a bit of Ben's story. But it's a powerful testimony to what God has done and who He is. And He put it on my heart to share that with you this morning. So Ben, at the time, as a year ago in January, 20 years old, he felt like God was nudging him to move to Idaho. His girlfriend at the time lived there. And with our blessing, we just knew God was moving in their lives and he needed to live closer to her. We could see that this would probably be a daughter-in-law. So Ben loaded up his car and packed up and headed off to Idaho from Haviland, Kansas. Long about Loveland, Colorado, Ben got disoriented and he wasn't speaking clearly. He wasn't making a lot of sense, and that kind of alarmed both of us, but especially his dad, being a retired fireman. So my husband said, "Son, you just don't sound right. Please pull over and call 911. At that point, we thought he was experiencing a migraine. Excuse me. He had a history of migraines. We thought maybe he was dehydrated. He just wasn't feeling well and wasn't sounding normal. And so he did pull over. I'm so thankful. And they came. The interesting thing that the EMS was right close by, and so just took a couple of minutes and they were there. And they called and asked my husband some questions. They said, "Does your son do drugs?" And we said, "Well, he never has, but he's in Colorado." No, I'm kidding. Just kidding. No, but he didn't have a history of that kind of thing, but he just sounded like he was high as a kite. He just didn't make any sense at all. And I said, "Well, we'll take him in." So they loaded him in the ambulance and took him over to the medical center of the Rockies, which was just about 10 minutes from where he pulled over. And here's where the story gets pretty dramatic. We got a phone call just a short time after that. I'll probably get emotional. We got a phone call that he had experienced a stroke, a full-on stroke. And at that point, the MRIs of his brain showed that there was a dead spot and that it was non-recoverable, that he had experienced a full-out stroke, and they weren't sure. They were just not sure what had happened. So my husband's brother he lives in Valley Center. He drove out, picked us up. We jumped into the car and we drove all night long and arrived at the hospital on a Saturday morning. And at that point is one of the most difficult times in my life. We walked in. Thankfully, I'm so thankful for the facility. At that time, there were still some COVID restrictions even a year ago because there had been some outbreaks. And patients were only allowed one visitor within a 24-hour period. But because of the severity of our son's case, the hospital allowed us to be with him together the whole time. And so we walked in and we sat down and we saw him, and he clearly did not look normal. At that point, right when we got there, one of the people came in to evaluate him for a stroke protocol. It's really difficult when your 20-year-old son doesn't know his first or his last name, doesn't know where he is, doesn't know the name of the town he lives in. It's very alarming. It's really difficult also to stay calm. He needed us to be normal and okay. And so to be able to just try to be normal when he was going through those procedures, it's very difficult. At that point, it was pretty scary. And then all day long, that first day, hospital personnel came in and evaluated him. The good news was he's stable. They didn't expect his condition to deteriorate, but it was pretty evident right away that he had speech trouble and that he would need speech therapy for that. His physical limitations were pretty minimal. He could do pretty much all the physical things. There was a little bit of coldness and warmness on one side, which is typical of stroke. But he couldn't walk and talk at the same time. We would walk a little bit and he was unable to speak while he was walking because he was impaired. So the first day was pretty overwhelming, just professional after professional explaining his condition and what we would need to do in the recovery. At this point in time, though, too, we were looking for answers. At this point, we didn't know what caused the stroke, and so being people that love Jesus, we just put out the word, please, just pray for us, pray for our son. And I know there are people in this room who did that. I'm very grateful. We have a good God. And within 48 hours, he revealed, we just said, please pray that they can find the source of the stroke so that we can begin the right treatment and do what we need to do for Ben. And within 48 hours, we discovered that this is amazing. Here's where we start. When Mike was talking about the little things, you're going to hear in a minute what some of the big things were, but some of the little things that became big things happened pretty quickly. One of the things is that my son pulled over 10 minutes from one of the best neurological and cardiological centers in the region. That literally, we had discovered this here, Dr. Fowler, our family doctor right here in Pratt, would have been to this hospital, where he stopped. And now we know the stroke had already happened and he was already impaired. And so stroke impaired, this boy drove himself under God's hand to the exact location he needed for treatment. And that to me is miracle number one. He drove to the exact place. At the medical center of the Rockies, there was a team of 20 doctors that worked on my son's case. There were, I think, 7 cardiologists, 3 neurologists. I mean, there were teams of doctors. It was not just one doctor. There were literally teams of the best people in their field looking at my son's case. And for that first 48 hours, they couldn't find the source. And so we just asked people, please pray, please pray. And then one cardiologist saw something on a picture, and the neurologist actually came in and said, we think this clot came from his heart because of the location. And so at that point they had a lead, because one of the early theories was, an intense migraine could cause something like this, but that's very, very rare. And so they were looking at tons of options. But one cardiologist noticed there was something funny about his heart, the picture. So they decided to do an esophageal, it's hard to say, it's where they go down his throat and take pictures of his heart. And again, they looked at that, didn't see anything. And then another cardiologist said, there is something on that heart valve. So now we know the rest of the story. Ben had a virus in January, just a regular virus, some kind of illness. People have asked if it's COVID. We have no idea. Because I keep backtracking, but you got to hear miracle number 2. He had strep right before and had been on antibiotics a day or two. Strep could cause a heart infection, but it hadn't had it long enough for that to be the case. So probably we'll never know what the original virus was. But the original virus attacked Ben's heart and caused infection in the heart valve. And so the strep medication started treating that a little bit, which was, I think, part of what saved Ben's life. So they found out that his heart valve was infected, and when your valve is infected, it creates this filmy substance called vegetation, and a piece of that vegetation had broken loose from his heart and went to his brain and caused the blockage. So it was not a clotting disorder, and again, it happens, but it's very, very rare. Ben, we also discovered, has a bicuspid heart valve, which means he just has 2 flaps instead of 3, which means it's a genetic weakness that makes him a little more prone to a heart valve infection. Here's the next miracle. Because they didn't know the source of the blockage in his brain, they started him on high-powered antibiotics immediately when he got to the hospital, which was the exact treatment he needed. And that's what God, again, used to save his life. Because had they not caught that immediately and begun shrinking all of that vegetation on his heart, Ben could have had multiple strokes and we would have lost him. We would have lost him like that. So that we found out that was, again, about 48 hours into the process, God revealed, and thankfully he had already started the process of the strep medicine and the right IV medication. So he was immediately on the right treatment. That Monday morning, I remember when I woke up, I didn't have very long to gather myself to go to the hospital. My husband and I kind of made a routine. Thankfully, they let my husband stay with Ben overnight, which is pretty rare, but there was a kind of a couch thing. And so my husband, he would stay all night there and then get up in the morning, and I would come to the hospital about 8 in the morning and stay with Ben through the day. And then mid-afternoon, my husband would go to the hotel and sleep and kind of catch up and take a shower or whatever, and I would stay with Ben, and then I would go home, back to the hotel about 9 or 10 at night. One of the interesting challenges with that is you have a 20-year-old and the doctors are coming in and being very professional and appropriately giving information to him and telling him about his condition, and Ben would smile and respond, and then he had no idea. He had no recall to be able to tell us what the doctors had said. And so we figured out pretty quickly one of us needed to be with him 24 hours at a time, because we could hear the information from the doctors and know what he needed, and know, because he couldn't retain the information. The people from the neurology side understood that a little better, but the cardiologists, my son is just really verbal and really... he understood in the moment, but they had no idea he wasn't catching and retaining any of that information. So we were able to stay with him and be able to take in the information and know what he needed. My son has a great sense of humor. One of the scary things in the beginning is he was so literal. Like, he didn't catch humor, he didn't laugh, and that was tough. Even though, again, now I get to tell you, early on they told us the prognosis was good, that this was a very rare situation, but they expected Ben's recovery to be at 98%. And so they were able to tell us that fairly early, but just a couple of days in, when your kid is almost a completely different person, I had to say, okay, they say he's going to be fine, but I don't know what I think, because he was just so not himself. Let me tell you what the Lord told me about that, and then I'll tell you how his humor, we began to see little signs that he was coming back. That Monday morning, before I got ready to get up and go into the hospital for the day, I just had a few minutes, and I knew I needed, for me, I don't know how people make it without Jesus. I can't get through a day without him, and I sure can't get through something big without him like that. And I needed just a couple minutes I didn't even have time to grab my Bible, but I had my Bible app on my phone, and I went to a couple of favorite passages and was just kind of spending a little time in the Word. And the Lord just kind of directed me to Hezekiah's story, where he is about to die. And he cries out to the Lord and said, God, please. And God hears his cry and gives him an extra 15 years of life. And Hezekiah's response, he says, the Lord heard my cry and spared my life and restored me to health. The Lord brought me to that verse, and I knew he was saying, I've heard your cry. I will spare your son,
and I will restore him to health. And believe me, he's done all three. And that was the word he gave me early on when Ben had no sense of humor. We were facing a lot of challenges. We were facing a lot of medical issues, and God gave me hope in that moment. And I can tell you today and stand here in all honesty and say he met all three of those things. He met all three of them. So now to a little bit of a happier part of the story. So as Ben's beginning to recover, I remember the first time or two where I would tease him a little bit and he would chuckle. About 4 or 5 days in, we really started to see a little more of the real Ben. One of my favorite moments was Ben went to Berkeley College, and when he was there, he was Bert in Mary Poppins for that production. And they were having a watch party the week he was in the hospital. So the production had been a while back, and the whole cast that was still around was gathering to watch it together at Berkeley College. And those students and Randy, the director, called us at the hospital and spoke with Ben. And that was the first time I saw Ben light up and smile. He saw his friends and he saw the people he had connected with. And he had, because part of what was affected was his recall and his memory. So to see people that he'd gone to school with and people that he loved just sparked that joy. And that was our first glimpse of seeing our son back a little bit. And so that was such a wonderful moment. So, and then from then we started to see more. So my son really is, like I was saying, he's kind of got some humor going on. So we're 4 or 5 days in, and I can see that little ornery spark coming back. And he says to me, he's starting to be more verbal, get more sentences together. Can't say everything he wants to, but he's starting to be able to communicate better. And he looks at me and says, "Mama," he goes, "I want to hide in that box and press the nurse button and see if she can't find me when she comes." I said, "Well, yesterday's nurse would have thought that was funny, but today's nurse maybe not so much." So he did not hide in the box. He meant he couldn't think of the word closet. So he wanted to hide in the closet and not let the nurse know where he was. So at that point, I was like, okay, he's starting to come back a little bit. Another great one about his story. We were getting ready to be dismissed from the hospital at the end of the week, and God just sent us the right nursing staff. I've always been thankful for godly men and women who choose medical profession, but I'm telling you, God sent us Christian people who loved him to help us. There was a young man in particular named Sal, who was a young male nurse. When your 20-year-old son needs help in the shower in the restroom, you don't want some pretty little cute thing. You really want a young man with some muscle and some bulk and less awkwardness. So we just really appreciated the people that God sent. One of the young ladies that was one of his female nurses came in, and my son has a gift for sharing Jesus with people and loving people. And he kind of connected with her, and right before we left, he just said, "Hey, I'd like to pray with you, for you. Would it be okay if I pray for some things?" And she opened up and shared a little bit, some personal things in her life that she asked for prayer for. And then she looked at Ben and she said, I could pray for you too. What would you like for me to pray for you?" And his eyes twinkled, and he looks at her and goes, "Well, I did have a stroke." And then he said, "Oh, too soon?" So again, his humor started to come back pretty quickly. Then the rest of the journey in terms of, we were there at the hospital about a week. By then, Ben was starting to show a little bit more of his true colors, think, okay, we're going to be okay. So they sent us home after a week in the hospital, and Ben was on IV fluids 24 hours a day for a total of 8 weeks. So when he got home, we had to get up in the middle of the night and hook up home IV systems, and probably about 7 to 8 times a day we were hooking up things and unhooking. Ben's a really sharp kid, but with a brain injury in the middle of the night, he was not coherent enough to do that safely. During the daytime, he was more coherent and able to change his stuff, but in the night it just wasn't. So in some ways it was like having a newborn, where Dawn and I had to set alarms and get up at different times and kind of help him with those things. And again, He was Ben, but I would say when we brought him home, he was a younger version of himself. I would say his functionality when we brought him home was about junior high level Ben. For example, we were in the kitchen and just getting ready to change his IVs, and you lay out everything and it's sterile, and you have to have all your little alcohol pads, and you have to make sure your hands have been washed enough seconds. And my son reaches down and pets the cat and then gets ready to change. I'm like, no, you can't change your, and he's like, why? Like, you can't change your IV stuff right after you pet the cat. And, 20-year-old Ben without impairment would have totally understood that was an incredibly dangerous thing to do, because he had what we call a central line, not just a central line means his permanent IV port poured IV fluids right directly over his heart. So he had to open, we had to take really good care of that because infection could be deadly. And so he, mentally understood that petting a cat was a bad idea, but at that functionality, it didn't make a lot of sense to him. So, but even in a few weeks, he started making pretty rapid progress, and he did go to speech therapy. Very thankful. He did that here in Pratt. Yeah. Deb May was his therapist, and she's phenomenal. So he came over, and so we were doing regular IV things. Here's another interesting thing what God did. My husband retired from firefighting full-time in Sedgwick County in December and was looking for a part-time job kind of thing because the retirement was good, but, just needed that little extra to make ends meet, and nothing would open up. He searched and couldn't find anything, and we knew we'd be okay, but oh my word, God in his provision. There's no way my husband could have worked during that 6-month period when we were in Ben's recovery. My husband was free and able to take care of our son and drive him back and forth to appointments. At that time, I'm still teaching and not as available. I helped too, but really my husband was my son's full-time caregiver, and God in his mercy provided not getting a job so that he could be available to my son. And I guess I want to just comment on that sometimes our expectations, when God doesn't answer the way we expect, just know he's still providing. It may not look like you thought it was going to look, but he absolutely knows what he's doing. And had my husband been in a brand new job, I don't know how we would have cared for our son in that time period. And God provided financially too. That was the other crazy thing. That's another long story that I can share with you if you'd like to hear it. But God provided for us financially so that we didn't have to worry about it in those months that he was not working. So fast forward, Ben continues to recover. He is not allowed to drive, which is really a bummer for him. He was not happy about that. The other thing, my son, right near the end, he's nearing the end of his recovery period. I do need to tell you one quick thing, and then I'm trying to think which one I want to tell first. I think I'll go ahead and tell you, I need to tell the middle part of the story. So one of the things, we went home, we were on IV stuff, he's doing all his recovery things, but one of the things that's still a big deal on the radar is that heart valve infection. So people are praying like crazy, and the deal is if that infection does not clear up on its own, then Ben will have to have a heart valve replacement. And at that point, will be on blood thinners the rest of his life. So that appointment the stroke happened at the end of January, and that appointment was set for the middle of March. So we just asked people to pray that God would take care of that. And when we went in March, all of the infection was cleared, and Ben did not have to have a heart surgery. If he had, God would have provided for that. One of the things I think is really cool that I didn't know, they can now do a heart valve replacement through the groin, that it doesn't have to be an open heart procedure, which is fascinating to me. And Ben was eligible for that type of surgery. But again, he didn't need that. He now gets checked once a year just to make sure everything's good. So, but I have to tell you the thing he did right before he moved, because I just wanted to strangle him. So we get the call at church, because he's 20. And he can't drive, and he can't go anywhere, and he can't do anything, and all of his friends are in school. And so some of those recovery days were kind of a long haul for a young man. And one time we were at church, and we're at a prayer meeting kind of thing, and we get this text from
our son, just a few days. We now know his heart's going to be okay. He has to finish the IVs. He's going to get out his central line pretty soon, and he just can hardly stand it. This is the kid who, when he was a kid, he would walk around the house and do handstands against the wall. We have a staircase that has it, and he would hang from and do pull-ups. This is a kid who's always moving. And so being somewhat confined and limited, he can't do physical activities very much with the central line. That's just not possible. So we get this text, and he goes, Mom, the end of my line is, it's bleeding a little bit, and it's starting to split open a little bit up here in his bicep where it's inserted. And so we get a little bit alarmed, and we go home and we check him over, and we call the doctor, and it stops on its own, and we're okay. A few days later, after they remove it, we find out he was out running as hard as he could. Oh, I know what it was. He was running and kicking a soccer ball. But then, this is such a Ben thing to do. He comes in the house, he's flexing in the mirror. He's standing in front of the mirror, and he's flexing, and and he pops his blood vessel on his central line. So this is my son. And he's such a great kid. So at Easter time, we moved him. At that point, he got cleared by his doctors to drive, and so he moved to Meridian, Idaho, and wow, has God provided. So he moved there. He was able to take the job that he was originally offered. He works in custom cabinetry. If it were anyone else in any other situation, that would sound scary and dangerous to me. But my son, we have an excellent shop program at Kiowa County High School, and our students are taught about safety from day one, and they're very well instructed. And it was something that he knew really well, and that he wasn't learning a new skill. So I wasn't worried about him being stroke impaired and running saws and planers and those kinds of things. It's something he was so comfortable with that he could do that. Here's the other part. He didn't have to talk to people all day. He didn't have to write receipts or do math or read or do all the things that were still really hard for him. Those things didn't come back for an awfully long time, but he was able to drive, he was able to have a job and provide for himself and live in his girlfriend's aunt's basement. So as a mom, again, he didn't need to live with another person, but just having an adult in the house just to check on him, make sure he was okay. So God just really provided. He asked Riley to marry him. They got married in August. It's one of those deals. I watched their relationship, just a real quick, I watched that relationship change from really liking each other and thinking that God is at work there. We could see that, to watching that young lady stand by him in the worst time of his life. And when she's okay with me telling this, I've cleared this with her. Early in the situation, my husband called and just said, Riley, if we don't know what this is going to look like. And he's starting to say, you're not committed here in the sense that if this is too much. And she just stopped him. She says, no, I know who your son is, and I would marry him tomorrow, even if he never recovers. She's a jewel. She's a godly woman. And she prayed for my son, and she stood by his side and helped him in his recovery in ways that even as parents, we couldn't help him. And so we were really positive that she was the one, and they got engaged in May and married in August. A little bit of a shorter story than some, but I think when you've looked at life and death and said, this is my person and this is who God has for me, it's okay. So they got married in August. It's really interesting in Ben's journey. It really has taken him a full year to recover. But I can tell you today, I would say he's at that 98 to 100%. Even in September, they flew back here for a wedding, and my son and Ben did the best man speech. So we're talking, the stroke was in January, and he gave his speech in September at that wedding. It was a struggle for him to write down his thoughts. And this is a kid who drove me crazy because he could get straight A's in college and not even crack a book. And so for him to struggle to write, it was such a victory to see him write that speech and speak for it was 5 to 10 minutes. And this is also a kid who could memorize monologues and speak for 15 to 20 minutes, at the drop of a hat. So for him to lose that capability and have to ease his way back into it, it's been a journey and a challenge. But I can tell you, it's still sometimes reading bothers him a little bit, just for him to keep his focus. And the language has been he's so verbal, you wouldn't know it, but it's taken him a long time for the words to come back and for him to be able to express himself fully. But I can tell you this too, God has used it in his life, and you can ask him, and people ask him, Ben, what was, what, he goes, you know what? Life is rough, but he said, you know what I've learned through this? God is good. God is good. And so that's our journey in the past year. And I just wanted to share that with you and let you know. Thank you for those of you that prayed, but it's really a testament to God's faithfulness. I couldn't have made it through this journey. We couldn't have done it without the help of the Lord. And he was faithful to what he told me in that early stage. He saved my son's life and restored him to health. He took care of it all. And Ben is doing really well today. So that's the story for the day. I hope that you can take something with you and that God has showed you a little bit of who he is through that story today.
We hope you have been encouraged and challenged by today's sermon. If you want to hear each week's message, be sure to subscribe to Friendly Words in your podcast app. May God bless you as you follow Jesus in the power of the Holy Spirit.